to a friend of mine, and we were speaking about church. And she just said that she's surprised at how many people have been hurt by church. And as we were unpacking this idea of how many people have been hurt by church, something came to mind, and I just said to her, how many relationships do you have that have never caused you pain? She's like, what do you mean? And I said, well, every relationship in my life, every single solitary relationship, every family relationship, every friendship, every relationship I have ever had at some point has hurt me. I'm not saying that those are bad relationships, but when we are in relationship with other people, often we cause each other pain. And so I said to her, if every relationship you've ever had, even the relationship with your parents and your husband or your wife, if even those relationships cause you pain sometimes, then what makes you think that when you're in a relationship with a whole group of people called the church, what makes you think that those relationships won't at some point cause you disappointment or hurt or pain? And she kind of went, wow, I never thought of it that way. And I have to confess that even I had never thought of it that way. But when I read the New Testament, and today we're looking at all the other books of the New Testament, and if we had to look at every single solitary one, we would be here for a week. And so what we're going to do is I'm just going to do a brief introduction, and then we're going to focus on the letters of Peter. And I'm going to invite you that after this, go and do some of your own homework. Just go and read up a little bit about who James was and John and Hebrews. Who were the authors? Why were they written? What were those books about or those letters about? And then go read them. My personal favorite is James, because many people believe that it was the brother of Jesus who actually wrote the letter of James. But go look at that for yourself. But for today, just a reminder that every single solitary book of the New Testament, the Gospels, the letters of Paul, and now the letters in the rest of the New Testament, those were letters written to people, generally to address some kind of concern that the early church faced. And so if the early church faced those concerns, it is to be expected that the churches today would face concerns. And so bear that in mind every time you read a letter to the New Testament or in the New Testament. So today, I thought we would unpack Peter a little bit more. Now, a few things about Peter is, firstly, we'll unpack who Peter was. Peter, just three aspects of his life before Jesus, his life with Jesus, his life after Jesus. Before Jesus, Peter was a fisherman. He was part of the family business. It's believed in the Gospel of John that he was also a disciple of John the Baptist. Peter lived in the Galilean region. They believe that they've actually found Peter's house and uncovered that. If you look in your notes, you'll see pictures of the ruins of what they believe is Peter's house. Peter was also married. We know he was married because it speaks about his wife in the New Testament, and in the Gospels, we know the story of where Jesus heals his mother-in-law. So he was obviously married. He was a fisherman. He worked in the family business, and he lived in the region of Galilee. So that's what we know about Peter before Jesus. In terms of what we know about Peter with Jesus, Peter was one of the disciples that stood out. He just comes across as absolutely, the Afrikaans is voor op die wa. He just comes across as being very, very passionate, enthusiastic. He has all the answers. He answers first. He's the one who gets out of the boat and walks on water with Jesus. He's the one who, when Jesus says, "Who do people say I am?" he says, "Oh, you are the Messiah." Peter's the one that's there first all the time. It's believed that he might have been the one that cut off the ear when people were trying to arrest Jesus. He is this passionate, energetic, vibrant, rambunctious guy. But he's also, and I think it's because he was so out there, he's also one that made a lot of mistakes. He's the disciple that Jesus turns around and says to him, "Get behind me, Satan," because he says to Jesus, "Stop saying you're going to die." He's the disciple, the only one who officially denied Jesus Christ at the crucifixion. Peter, as much as he was also the one that took his eyes off Jesus and started to sink. So as much as Peter was always one of the top disciples in the sense that he was always there and answering and passionate, he was also the disciple that made seemingly the most mistakes. Peter was also the disciple that Jesus said about him that on you my church will be built. You will have the keys to heaven. And that's why even today, if you look at ancient pictures of Peter, like statues or artwork about Peter, especially from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, if you look at those, you'll see that Peter's often depicted as having keys in his hand. So if you ever see a picture of a disciple with keys in their hand, that automatically makes us know that it was Peter they were speaking about, because he had the keys to the kingdom. He also is sometimes depicted as having fish at his feet. And that's a reminder that not only is he a fisherman of men, but it's also a reminder that it was after the resurrection that Jesus had that fish fry and invited Peter into a conversation where he reinstated Peter. It's actually called Peter's reinstatement. And so this is who Peter is during the time of Jesus. He is passionate. He's also one of the inner three. Jesus had his disciples, but it seems like there were 3 disciples, and one of them was Peter, that were very close to Jesus. So when there was the transfiguration, it was Peter was part of that. He was one of the 3 that was taken up and witnessed the transfiguration. When Jesus went into the Garden of Gethsemane and he withdrew, he took 3 disciples with him. Peter was one of them. So we see that Peter was not only passionate and energetic and zealous for Christ, but we also see that he was part of this very close relationship with Jesus. And he was one of the disciples that seemingly put his foot in it all the time. Post Jesus, it's almost like we see after the resurrection, after the filling of the Holy Spirit, Peter takes the lead. Peter suddenly becomes the head of the church. He's the guy that stands up and proclaims the message of Jesus after Pentecost. He's the one that then leads the church in the way forward. He's the one that activates the mission, that speaks on behalf, that heals people. He becomes the head of the church. And it's almost as though after that moment, everything, after the infilling of the Holy Spirit, everything that was good about Peter is highlighted, it's aggravated, it becomes more, but this sense that he rushes into things and that he puts his foot in it, that seems to become less. And he starts to become the person that Jesus saw he would be. He really becomes, he changes from Simon to Peter. He really becomes the rock. The rock. Talking about Simon and Peter, I know his name is Peter, and sometimes we call him Cephas. Sometimes you'll read that people will talk about Cephas. That was just a language thing. The Greek for rock was Petros, so it was Peter, but the Aramaic for rock was Cephas. And so that's why it's the same name, it was just 2 different languages. And that's who Peter becomes, is he becomes this fierce disciple and missionary. Peter originally ministered to the Jews. Later on, he actually then starts to minister to the Gentiles as well. After his encounter at Caesarea, his vision where God tells him that he can eat all the things that are unclean, he then starts a mission to the Gentiles. And Peter goes on a few missionary journeys of his own. You know, we always speak about the missionary journeys of Paul, but Peter himself goes on a few missionary journeys himself. What's interesting about Peter is that on his missionary journeys, he actually takes his wife with him. So Peter and his wife were a missionary couple. They did ministry together. They actually ministered side by side and went on all of these missionary journeys together. according to tradition, church tradition. So it's not in the Bible, but it's church tradition that has been passed down from generation to generation. Apparently, the story goes that eventually Peter was martyred. So he was killed for his faith. And the story goes that his wife was brought out and killed in front of him. And he said to his wife in that moment something along the lines of, keep the faith and stay strong. And then she was killed. After that, they then crucified him. And when they were going to lead him out to crucify him, he said that he does not deserve to die in the same way that Jesus died. And so he begged them to crucify him upside down. And so Peter was actually then crucified upside down for his faith. And so we just see that Peter really becomes who Jesus saw he would be. He becomes the person with the keys to the kingdom. He leads the church. He transforms people's lives. He goes on these missionary journeys. I love the fact that his wife goes with him. But Peter just becomes the rock which Jesus saw he would be. Until eventually he no longer denies his faith in the line of death. But he actually surrenders to it, and he's crucified upside down. And so that's the story of who Peter was. You can go and read about it in Acts. You can read about it in his letters. You just get the sense of who Peter was. And so we have two letters attributed to Peter. Whether they were written by Peter himself or people who followed Peter, that's debatable. Some people believe that particularly to Peter was not written by Peter. It seems to have been written at a much later stage. So some people believe that that was not from Peter, but was from one of his followers. Either way, once again, we need to remember that if it's attributed to Peter, it's Peter's thoughts, Peter's theology, Peter's mindset that people then might write about. That's why they attributed it to him. And so the first letter of Peter and the second letter of Peter, what's important to know is they were very, very different. You know, some of Paul's letters, you can kind of see a lot of similarities in them. But Peter 1 Peter and 2 Peter, they were very, very different. And they were clearly written in different situations. 1 Peter is written very much from the perspective of suffering. It seems that the church was under massive persecution. They were being accused of a whole bunch of things. The Christians at that point were being accused of a whole bunch of things. It was under an emperor who was a little bit psychotic. And he believed that he was a god. And so he tried to get everyone to worship him. And obviously the Christians wouldn't. And so a sense of persecution broke out. And they were accused for a whole bunch of things. They were accused of not being human. They were accused of ruining the economy, or not being human, but not promoting humanity. They were accused of all these different aspects. And so persecution broke out. And 1 Peter really is about facing persecution well. It's about having faith in the line of suffering. It's about suffering well and knowing that all suffering will lead to the goodness of God. It was about living life well, even in the midst of persecution and hardships. That's what 1 Peter was all about. Just listen to what he says. And so he deals, sorry, I'll read it now, but what he does is he deals with how to suffer well. How to live life well, even in the midst of persecution and suffering and hardships and trials. And so he deals with this righteous living in the midst of suffering and how God will work and deal with suffering and use it for good. Let's listen to what he says, for example, in 1 Peter 4 from verse 1. Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because he who has suffered in his body is done with sin. As a result, he does not live the rest of his earthly life for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans chose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. They think it strange that you do not plunge with them into the flood of dissipation and they heap abuse on you. But they will have to give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. Thanks be to God for his word. And so Peter really deals with this idea of how do you live life well, so don't fall into the traps of these evil deeds, but live life well, even in the face of persecution and suffering and hardships, and God will use it for good. And so if ever you're going through a time where you feel like life is really tough, I think 1 Peter would be a good letter to read. The second letter of Peter dealt with a completely different aspect. It seems that what had happened is that this must have been quite a lot later, and so the main issue of the church was not necessarily persecution any longer, but the main issue was that a whole group of people had risen up and were starting to become false prophets and false teachers. So they were teaching things that weren't real, and that was giving Christianity a bad name. I remember at the beginning of 2020, just after COVID hits, I think it was level 5, somebody sent me a video clip of a prophet. And this prophet stood up, and it was a very funny video clip. Perhaps you can Google it and just have a look. But he stands up, and he has thousands of people in front of him, and it was obviously 2019 when this video was taken. And he stands up and he says to the people, God took me, I had a vision, and God took me into 2020, and I went to January. And God took me to February 2020. And this is what he's saying to the people. He says, God took me to March 2020. God took me to April 2020. He took me to May, June, July, August, September. He took me to October 2020. He took me to November 2020. He took me to December 2020. And you know what? It is a good year. God showed me 2020 is going to be the best year. And he just goes on about how he's had this vision that 2020 will be the best year people have ever had. And everybody cheers. And then we're watching it in 2020 as everything comes to a standstill because of a virus. And I think to myself, like, that was some kind of false prophecy. It was someone who was in it for himself. And this is what 2 Peter deals with. Suddenly, the church has been going for a while. People, they've survived some kind of persecution. And suddenly people within the church start preaching these false prophecies. They start teaching these false prophecies and these false teachings. And it's giving the apostles a bad name and Christianity a bad name. And so what 2 Peter is all about is it's all about dealing with these false prophets and these false teachings and telling them what is real. The other thing that they deal with is now, it seems that Christianity has been going for quite a while, and Jesus hasn't come. And at the beginning, just after the ascension, all the disciples, the apostles, the followers of Jesus, they all believed it would be a very short time and then Jesus would be back. Now they've lost generations. People have come and gone. They've been waiting for the second coming of Jesus Christ. It's been close to probably 100 years. Nothing has happened. And they're going, is this all real? And so 2 Peter also deals with this delay in the second coming of Christ. So those are really the 2 aspects that 2 Peter deals with, is this idea of false prophets and this idea of the delay in what we call the parousia, which is the second coming of Christ. And so I invite you, just spend a few minutes. It won't even take you very long because the letters of Peter are not long at all. Just take a few minutes with this in mind, of that 1 Peter was written for persecution and hardships. 2 Peter was written for the idea of false prophets and how to keep faith even when Jesus hasn't come back. Bear that in mind and read the 2 letters and just see how they come alive for you. Let's see what stands out for you. Ask yourself the question, in what ways do I also struggle with knowing the difference between truth and falsehood? In what ways do I also struggle with this idea of, is the second coming going to happen? And then read 2 Peter. Ask yourself, in what ways have my life been difficult? Or has there been suffering and pain in my life? And then read 1 Peter and just see how those letters speak to you. Now, that's the incredible thing about the New Testament, is that they were real people writing real letters to real life situations. And generally, there was some kind of hardship, struggle, conflict into which they wrote. And when we understand that, it helps us face those things ourselves. And so I just invite you to spend some time in the New Testament unpacking these letters that were written thousands of years ago and yet are still so applicable even to us today. Amen.